for ecological restoration monitoring. This workshop was organized and is being hosted by SER Rocky Mountains chapter. My name is Jana Heisler-White, and I'm one of the members of the outreach committee. And this workshop today we're really excited about because we've brought together 3 speakers who will be talking about really some key aspects of ecological restoration monitoring, from monitoring program design to data collection approaches to software to statistical analyses. So a really broad spectrum of topics as they relate to ecological restoration monitoring. We hope you can attend all 3 days, but if you cannot, we will be making these presentations available at a later time and recording them. And I guess one other programming note, we will not be holding our Friday discussion as originally planned. Instead, please be on the lookout for a survey where we're going to be kind of polling our members and others who are interested about potential challenges and opportunities in ecological restoration monitoring to inform future webinars and maybe some discussion topics as well. For SER members, CERP credit is available, so please look into that if that's something that you're interested in wanting to obtain for today. And then I guess as a final quick plug, this particular workshop is available due to our Rocky Mountains chapter. And so if you're interested and live in the Rocky Mountains, please consider affiliating with our chapter, as membership dues are part of what covers the cost of these kinds of things. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike Curran, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Jana. Yeah, I'm excited to introduce Tim Robinson. Tim's a professor of statistics at University of Wyoming and has pretty broad research interests, including data science, sampling design, and statistical modeling. A lot of it is applied to ecology and the environment. Tim regularly provides statistical consultation for a variety of government and industrial partners, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the EPA, and the Wyoming Department of Health. Tim is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and the American Society for Quality. And today, Tim is going to be giving us a evidence-based roadmap for some monitoring things to consider when conducting ecological restoration monitoring. Thanks.
Hey, thanks so much, Mike. And thanks, Jana, for the invite to give this talk today. Also, thank you, all the participants, all the folks that are listening in today. I sure appreciate you taking the time to listen. As Mike said, my name is Tim Robinson. I'm a professor of statistics within the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Wyoming. I have a lot of collaborators to thank for their contributions to this talk, and I'll acknowledge them at the end of the presentation. Just a little bit of background. I've been interested in this topic for quite some time now due to my consulting experience. As a consulting statistician, I've been fortunate to be involved with many interesting projects over the years. And in many cases, my role has been to help a team triage their data. By this, I mean projects where there's been lots of data that's been collected, but the data was not informing management. So how does this happen? And how do we prevent this from happening? I think we prevent this by taking an evidence-based approach to monitoring. So what exactly is evidence-based management? And I think if you look around, there's lots of different definitions for this, and I've sort of compiled the different definitions into the one that you see on this screen. And I think that evidence-based management involves conscientious, explicit, judicious use of our current best evidence in making decisions. So if you're like me, I think there's a lot of different ways you can take some of these words in bold. So conscientious, by this, I mean that we're thorough in our decision-making process, and we're not just making decisions simply based on our own experience, but rather we're thinking deeply and involving a collaborative team. By explicit, I mean that we develop a clear definition of the problem as well as a model for the system that we're monitoring. And by judicious, I mean that we're using good judgment. And again, this involves not making decisions in a vacuum, but rather working as a team. And current best evidence is a combination of literature or science, as well as a plan for collecting new information about the system. So the idea of evidence-based management really has been around, like I said, for a little bit of time now. There's been a few papers written. This is certainly not the only two that have been written that provide a framework for evidence-based management as it relates to conservation or restoration. But I would definitely view these as two great reads. And the paper by Reynolds et al. In 2016 provides a roadmap. So the title is a roadmap for design and implementing a biological monitoring program. And we're going to really that roadmap boils down to three main components. And I've got to the right of this slide, and involves a phase where we frame the problem, a phase where we design the monitoring plan, and one where we implement and learn. And this paper by Gann et al. That's at the bottom here is an excellent read, particularly in section 3, where Gann and co-authors talk about standards of practice for planning and implementing restoration projects. So I've done quite a bit of work over the last year with various folks in the inventory and monitoring program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of a working group, where the whole charge for the working group was the following, is that we know that there's these good papers out there that talk about a structural framework, but why is it that there are so many management or so many monitoring plans out there that are not using an evidence-based approach? And what we've discovered is that having papers out there that go through the framework is very useful, but maybe what's even more useful is to illustrate the components of the framework with examples. So my goal over the next 45 minutes is really to lay out the tenets of evidence-based management with a specific example. And all those things that you see to the right are things that I'm going to address with the example. So let me provide some background on the example that one of the consulting projects that I've been working on over the last several years. It involves the prairie pothole region of the US. The prairie pothole region is that area in blue that you see that goes from the upper Midwest all the way through some Canadian provinces. It's estimated to cover about 715,000 square kilometers. It's filled with wetlands, hills, and lakes that were thought to be formed by glaciers as they melted and moved through the area more than 10,000 years ago. The prairie pothole region, why is it significant? Well, it produces nearly half of the ducks in North America. Most migratory bird species in North America have the prairie pothole region as part of their life cycle, and the prairie pothole region provides critical habitat for pollinators. So what's the issue with the prairie pothole region? Well, over the last 50 years or so, it's estimated that more than half of these potholes have been drained for agricultural use, and in many places, over 90% of these areas have been drained. And there's been a lot written about the destruction of the habitat in this particular region. So in response to these habitat losses, the Duck Stamp Act was passed by the US Congress back in 1934, requiring waterfowl hunters to purchase a duck stamp. In 1958, the US Fish and Wildlife Service began using duck stamp dollars to purchase land in the prairie pothole region to protect wetlands and grasslands for breeding waterfowl. And the areas purchased through this program are known as waterfowl production areas, or WPAs. WPAs are managed by national wildlife refuges within the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And a few years ago, I was invited to provide biostatistical support to some of the national wildlife refuges in Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota through the US Fish and Wildlife Service Inventory and Monitoring Program. So as you may recall from the first slide, I mentioned that the very first thing, maybe one of the most critical aspects on this roadmap for evidence-based monitoring, is that we have to do a good job of framing the problem. And when I mention framing the problem, it's essential that we talk about all aspects that are on this page. And this takes quite some time to actually frame the problem. While I'm not going to read through each of these individual pieces, I'm going to explain some of these aspects of framing the problem with a specific example related to the prairie pothole region. So as I mentioned, why is the work being done in this particular area? Why is this an important problem? Well, I've already talked about the ecological significance of the prairie pothole region in terms of duck nesting habitat, habitat for pollinators, as well as migratory songbirds. So the specific example within the prairie pothole region I'm not going to deal with the entirety of the prairie pothole region, but rather an area called the Madison Wetland Management District in east central South Dakota. This area manages 222 of those waterfowl production areas that I talked about. These waterfowl production areas are located within 9 South Dakota counties. And these waterfowl production areas are essentially islands within a sea of agricultural land. So when I talk about framing the geographical scope, it's important that you have a map of the area that you're interested in. And in this particular case, I've got a snapshot of that map, and the WPAs are these figures that I have outlined in green. So that, as you can see, it's like they are islands within this sea of agricultural land. Now, the second step that I mentioned as far as framing the problem, it talks about the temporal and geographic scope. In this particular case, the Madison Wetland Management District was interested in a 5-year plan. So what information is needed about this resource in order to make decisions? Well, I need to provide just a little bit more background before I get into some of the details about the information. The waterfowl production areas in the Madison Wetland Management District, like their surrounding area, you have to remember these areas were once farmland. And before that, of course, they were native prairie. In 1969, when these lands were purchased in South Dakota, they were originally planted with cool season grasses like smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass, because at that time, and it still is the case, that provides excellent habitat for ducks. However, as science has progressed and we began to realize the importance of this area for the migratory songbirds as well as pollinators, it was understood that we not only needed these cool season grasses, but rather we needed a diverse seed mix in order to provide a proxy for what we actually had was the native prairie long before agriculture took over. I don't know what you know about the native prairie in this area, and I'm certainly not a grassland ecologist, but from my understanding, there were over 250 plant species in this area. And so there's no way, if we're going to reconstruct the prairie, that we're going to have a seed mix of 250 different plant species. But if we strategically, and I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but it's thought that about a seed mix of 20 to 30 different native prairie species that are strategically chosen to fill the ecological niches in this area would provide a fairly reasonable proxy for the original native prairie. So back to the question of what information do we need to actually improve decision making? Well, see, what happens in this area is that when a farm was purchased and you look at the historical maps, you can tell where the historical potholes were located. And so what happens is that area is excavated out so that there's some ponding that takes place and that the wildlife returns to the area. But then once you seed the area with the native prairie seed mix, you have to actually manage that in order for the prairie to be reconstructed in the way that's optimal for the species that live there. So another thing to keep in mind, the reason I have fire and grazing down at the bottom of this slide is that we have to think back on what the native prairie experienced in the past. And it was, there was unsuppressed fire back in the day, and there was also grazing by bison. Whereas now we suppress fires and we also, grazing, it's overgrazed by cattle. So if we go back, we talked about what information is needed. Well, we need to understand when to manage this particular resource, the management techniques that are going to be used are going to be prescribed burns as well as managed grazing, or whether or not to leave the particular land idle. So we need information from this resource to decide what management are we going to use and when are we going to undertake that management. Now, the last two bullets here on this slide, as far as who has the authority to make decisions and who are the stakeholders, really this gets to the politics of any kind of management or monitoring process. Now, while we don't have time to get into the politics of decision making in this particular example, I think we all understand the futility of making decisions within a vacuum. This lady has no long-term hope of preventing dandelions from taking over her yard unless she's able to work with her neighbors. So the second step, as far as coming up with an evidence-based approach, is that you have to explicitly lay out the goals and objectives of your project. So goals represent the core outcomes that you care about, sort of a pie in the sky vision for what you hope to achieve. And in this particular case, one goal of many in this area is to reconstruct the prairie plant communities in these WPAs located within the Madison Wetland Management Area in order to provide for long-term sustainability and resilience. So while that's one of the overall goals, we need something more specific to allow us to actually be able to assess whether or not we are meeting our management goals. So you've probably heard the expression SMART objectives, and SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. So here's an example of a SMART objective that would be related to the goal that's above. Remember, I mentioned that it's a 5-year monitoring program. So we might say over a 5-year period, increase native vegetation composition by at least 5% in these grassland reconstructions. So notice that it's specific because we're explicitly stating that we want to have a 5% increase in the native vegetation composition. It's time bound with the 5 years, measurable. So we're assuming that we can actually measure vegetation composition on these WPAs. And as far as achievable and realistic, achievable really gets into whether or not you have the resources to go out and actually perform those measurements. And realistic would be, is it realistic to expect this resource, the prairie, to respond within a 5-year period of time? Now, step 3 of an evidence-based management approach would be to develop what's known as a concept model or a conceptual model. Now, there's a whole lot written in the literature about these particular models, and they can get quite complicated in a hurry. A good reference, if you want to learn more about this, is from the Conservation Measures Partnership. Now, let me give you some guidance about how to read these concept models, because it took me a while to really understand how you read these. And really, you start by reading from right to left. And on the right-hand side, you see that really what we're interested in is waterfowl production. We're also interested in the migratory birds as well as the pollinator species. And as we keep moving from right to left, we know that these particular species require good, healthy grasslands in order to survive. Key attributes, those are the variables that we're going to use to actually measure the efficacy or maybe even make decisions in our management process. And I'm going to talk about these attributes here in just a minute in a little bit more detail. But the one that we're going to focus on is vegetation composition. So the idea is that if we can keep track of the vegetation composition and we can note that the native species are increasing in their proportion of coverage, that will result in healthy grasslands, which will then translate into more sustainable and more productive waterfowl species being there, as well as migratory birds and pollinators. Now, with any kind of monitoring process, there are stresses on the system. And as I mentioned, the native prairie had unsuppressed fire, and there was also bison that grazed the range. So if we have overgrazing, or if we have suppressed fire, or maybe there's noxious weeds, there's all kinds of things that can threaten that native prairie landscape, or that are stresses on that landscape. And then the threats are those things that are taking place that actually cause the stresses. So now on the far left of that diagram, you see the different management strategies that we're going to talk about. And so the management strategies are designed to address the threats. And the idea is that if we can effectively deal with the threats, that will inhibit the stresses, which means that we're going to have better vegetation composition, which means we're going to have better grasslands, which is going to have the end result of the characteristics that we're really interested in. Now, so the conceptual model reveals to us right now what data we're going to need. We have to have information on vegetation composition. We're going to use that to address how effective our management is. And I'm also going to show you that we're going to use that to actually inform what management action to take. Now, before I go any further in this, when you put a concept model together, it's really important that you assess the attributes that you are intending to measure. So in our particular case, our overall goal is to provide good nesting habitat for the ducks, the migratory songbirds, and for pollinators. However, there are, some of the things that we might use to actually measure success might be duck abundance or waterfowl species richness or pollinator abundance or pollinator species richness. I mean, you can talk to lots of different people and they will have lots of different ways for counting ducks or songbirds or pollinators and looking at species richness. And I'm sure there's a whole suite of other things that we could be looking at. So if you look back at the concept model, under the key attributes, one of those blue ovals might be duck abundance or pollinator species richness. And what I mean by critically assessing these attributes is that it may be really infeasible when you think about the resources required to actually get at these measures. So while these are in and of themselves terrific attributes, and there's lots of papers written on how we can have precise measurements related to these attributes, the fact is it's very difficult to get accurate measures of abundance, especially with something that moves. There's measurement error that's due to double counting. It often involves very expensive equipment. It's often very time consuming. And if you've ever tried to count anything that moves, you know that it's going to seek cover. So you may count a certain number of songbirds, but there's probably a lot of them that you don't see. And while there's ways to get at that, it's more time and more effort associated with the process. So in this particular case, we decided that vegetation composition was something that we could afford to measure. And the idea or the philosophy that we're going to have is if we build the habitat, then they will come. Now we get into the design phase. So the design phase is about the information that's actually needed to inform management. And how do we actually collect that information? So you always should start with asking yourself, what type of information do I even need in order to manage this system? It's very possible that you may only need a literature review. So in other words, you may not even need to collect any data on your particular resource. So let's take, for instance, in this concept map, if you look at the first management action up there would be herbicides as they relate to invasive plants. And so you may be wondering, well, what type of herbicide is best when we are reconstructing the prairie? Well, that question may have already been addressed by somebody else, and you may not even have to collect any data. And so I've just got an example here of where you might be lucky that there's been something that's already been written that's precisely addresses the question that you have of interest. And using existing information from the literature is much faster, much more cost effective than actually collecting new data. Another possibility that would involve a very cheap collection of data might be an experimental design. So if we go back to that idea of herbicides and noxious weeds, maybe you have a couple of different herbicides and you're trying to decide which one is best, and there's not been anything written in the literature about it. But you can address this, the efficacy of herbicides, with a very small experimental design. And what I've got here at the bottom, the way you might want to conceptualize this, the population, let's say that the pink dots are low diversity sod. Maybe it's just the cool season grasses, excuse me, of smooth brome. and so then the blue dots might be a high diversity sod. And so what you could do is take very small study plots representing both types of diversity of vegetation types, randomly assign some of those to receive herbicide 1 and the other group to receive herbicide 2, and then just use very basic statistics to make the comparison, decide which herbicide is better. Now, the fact is, and the reason that most of you are all in attendance is not to learn about literature reviews or experimental design, but it's because you have management or monitoring situation that's on a much larger scale than just small study plots. Like in this particular case, we're talking about burning or grazing or leaving idle these WPAs, and they are several hundred acres in size. So we actually need a monitoring program. Now, if you go back to those papers that I mentioned at the onset of this talk, there's a variety of different types of monitoring. And I'm going to go through two of them because they relate to this particular example. So threshold monitoring, what this involves is taking data from our system. So you observe your system, and there is something about this system that you're going to measure that will actually trigger a particular management action. So remember, our management action candidates are burning, grazing, or leaving idle, and we also want to know when we're going to do that. So we need to observe our system to figure out when we're going to do those, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. Now, another type of monitoring that's often in conjunction with threshold is actually effectiveness monitoring. So we can put good grassland ecology to use here, and I'm going to address, like I said, threshold in just a minute. But you really, at the end of the day, you want to know whether or not that management strategy was working. And so effectiveness monitoring means that you're going to collect data on the system with one of the attributes of interest and determine whether or not your management was effective. So it usually involves some time component. It's before management is taking place, maybe a year after, 2 years after. So it's longitudinal so that you can actually see what's happening on the landscape as a result of your management. Now, a third type of management that I don't have time to get into today is adaptive management. And really, adaptive management is just a combination of threshold and effectiveness monitoring. And it's just going back and taking what you learn about the system and maybe readjusting the way that you're managing the system. And I'll kind of touch on this again a little bit later. But again, there's a whole lot to adaptive management, and there's lots of things that are already written on that. And I would highly recommend you looking more into adaptive management. Okay, so step 6 of this process is taking that conceptual model that I had earlier and actually translating this into a decision process. So let me help you understand this a little bit. So remember, here's our concept model. And I want you to focus on those strategies to the very left, the grazing or prescribed burns. And again, another thing that is actually there would be to leave the land idle. But those are the different decisions we need to make. So the question is, how do we know which WPAs to graze, which ones to burn, which to leave idle, and when to do so? Well, like I said at the beginning, I'm not a grassland ecologist, but I am part of the team here where they did have a grassland ecologist. And so apparently Grassland Ecology 101 suggests that your decision of how to manage the native prairie really depends on two variables, two primary drivers. One is the litter depth, or how deep is that dead vegetation that's out there on the landscape. And that's at the very left of this slide. And the second component in the decision-making process is what is your primary native plant deficiency. If you have that information about each of your WPAs, then you can come up with a very good decision process. So let me just walk you through this, and let me relate it to the previous slide. So in threshold monitoring, you observe the system, and your observation of that system will trigger a particular management action. Okay, so let's go to this little map. So let's say that our litter depth is high. So on the very left-hand portion of the slide, so we're going to get, that suggests that we are going to have to measure litter depth at the WPA level. We get a measure for it, and it's classified as high. If we think there's high litter depth, then we go over to the primary plant deficiency. And if the primary plant deficiency are forbs, and we're talking about native sod or high diversity sod, then we're going to burn that particular WPA in the summer. Now, if your primary plant deficiency was a cool season grass or a warm season grass, and you're in a low diversity plot of land, then you're either going to burn it. If it's a cool season grass, you're going to burn it in the fall. If it's a warm season grass, you're going to burn it in the spring. So again, what do we have to observe from our WPAs? We have to have data to inform management. And the data that we need is the litter depth, and we also need to know what the primary plant deficiency is. And once we have that information, that will then provide for us the best management practice. And I've got a reference for this. This is in the annual report for the Madison Wetland Management District that was worked up with a literature review with the ecologist in that particular region, if you're wondering where this decision process came from. Now we're at the stage where we have to figure out how are we going to get this information from our WPAs. And again, the information we need is a litter depth, and we also need to know something about the primary plant deficiency. So in other words, the plant composition. So when you design a sampling protocol, there is a lot to this, and it's super important that you get this correct, because if you get to this point in your roadmap and you've got this beautiful decision process laid out, but you don't collect your data in a representative way, and if you don't collect enough information, then you're not going to be able to inform management to an accurate manner. So what's involved with the protocol for data collection? And now there are books written about this, and I would recommend that you have a biometrician on your team to kind of walk through your data collection process. But here are some of the basic tenets that if you have a biometrician, you want to make sure that they can give a reason for each of these, and they've thought through each of these that I've got written down here. So we want to know, well, what resource will the data be collected from? In this particular case, this involves what scale of measurement is your management being conducted on? And it's at the WPA level. So we need data collected from each of the WPAs, because those are what we're actually managing. Now, I told you that these WPAs are several hundred acres in size. There's no way that you can census litter depth or even get a census of vegetation composition for each of these. So that implies you have to take a sample. Now, it would be very easy to get into the trap of just taking data from the roads or 2 tracks that are already out there where you have easy access, but you want to have random sampling when you are actually taking observations from the landscape. So in this particular case, when we measure litter depth, and we're also measuring the vegetation composition, we're going to do this using transects. And in this particular case, a pretty sexy transect, one that I've never seen before, is a G transect. There's some stuff written about it, and it's what the biologists thought was would be most informative for being able to get good ocular estimates of these measures that I've already talked about, and specifically the litter depth and the vegetation composition. So how will the sampling units be chosen? Well, there's a host of ways that you can actually choose these sampling units. We actually use something called balanced acceptance sampling. I see that Blair Robertson is one of the attendees today, and he's actually going to be presenting a talk on this tomorrow because he actually came up with balanced acceptance sampling. It's an incredibly useful and flexible tool. I'd highly encourage you just a plug for his talk tomorrow. And there's some very nice software for implementing these designs. Now, and then you also need to indicate how often you're going to take measurements. For instance, maybe we're going to take measurements each spring, and you also need to know how many sampling units are needed. So let me get into a little bit more details about what this looks like. So there was the Madison, a snapshot of that district up in the upper left. I've got one of the WPA circled in red, and I've blown it up in the upper right. And those Gs are just transects. They're 100-meter transects that the biologist is going to walk, and they're going to put quadrats down every 5 meters. Now those Gs are spatially balanced. And again, Blair will talk about that tomorrow. So what happens is that the biologist will go out to these locations, and it actually goes very quickly, just dropping these quadrats every 5 meters. You'll go to the midpoint of those quadrats, you put a ruler down, you figure out what that litter depth is, very quick reading there. You note the dominant species in that quadrat, and then for every other quadrat that you have, you're actually going to know which specific species is dominant in that particular quadrat. And given that information now, we're going to be able to go back and inform our decision-making process. Now, part of developing a sampling design is that you have to actually go back to what your management objectives were and then write out a sampling objective. Remember, we're not taking a census. And so when you make a statement like there's 25% of native vegetation, well, that's just an estimate. So how good is that estimate? Well, that deals with the margin of error and that sort of thing. So what I have at the bottom of this slide is an example of a sampling objective that's related to that SMART objective that you saw earlier. So let's say we have a 5-year monitoring period. We're going to use 95% confidence intervals and then we're going to have estimates of that native vegetation composition within 4% of its true value. That 4%, that comes from that idea of how many sampling units do you need to have so that you can get a fairly precise estimate of what that vegetation composition is. Now, I can't stress enough this particular slide. So you may come up with a great sampling design, a beautifully constructed, where your transects are going to be, where you're going to drop the quadrats. You've got a very cost-effective approach. But you cannot forget, how are you going to manage that data once you actually select it? It's estimated that over 30% if you do this correctly, over 30% of a monitoring program's budget needs to be devoted to the design of the data management system. Now, let me explain just very briefly in this slide why I've got these particular pictures here. What does a lake have to do with data management? In the upper left of this slide, this is a lake that's that's in Canterbury, New Zealand. This is called Lake Forsyth, and this lake is hypertrophic. And my understanding of what a hypertrophic lake is that there is a lot of inflow and provides lots of nutrients that are flowing into this lake. And at one time, this lake had an outflow to the ocean, and it no longer has that outflow to the ocean. So there's lots of potential because of all of the nutrients that are flowing into this lake, but without an outflow, that lake has become toxic. And the same expression, the idea of data lakes, applies to monitoring programs. Data lakes are when you have data in so many different locations, you don't have very well-defined standards. Data may be in different types. Maybe you've got some videography data, you've got data in Excel spreadsheets, you have no idea how to stitch that stuff together, and your storage is overwhelming. In those situations, your data will never inform management because it just sits in this lake and becomes a very toxic situation because you've spent millions of dollars collecting the data and it's never informing the management. So what are solutions to this? Well, again, we could spend an entire talk on this, but this gets into what a lot of people refer to as data science. And the solutions would be that you actually have standards for your data structure, that you have clear definitions for your variables, that the formatting is clearly laid out before you collect the data. Relational databases is something that is very helpful in this context. And it's also very helpful if your data recording goes directly to the cloud. There's lots of ways you can fix this problem, but there are many, many, many monitoring projects that get held up at this particular point. All right, so let's say we have a good, our data is managed, we've got it all sorted, it's in the cloud. So now we still haven't gotten to the point of how it is actually going to be distributable to the folks that are making decisions. Remember, we're making decisions about fire or grazing or idle based on what the litter depth is and based on the vegetation composition, and all that information right now is sitting in the cloud. Well, once the data management system's been designed, you've gotten the data, you have to prepare that data for analysis. And this is often referred to as data wrangling. And again, you could get a good applied statistician, biometrician, a data scientist can help you with this. And this essentially involves cleaning the data, especially if you've got data in different types, to stitch that together so that you can have distributable files for analysis by the biometricians. And going back to budget, it's estimated that over 15% of the budget is really devoted to this data wrangling phase. This takes an incredible amount of time, and you can't overlook it when you're trying to budget for a project. Okay, so data analysis. Really, data analysis should start before you even collect your data and involving a power analysis. I showed you a WPA with those different G transects. Well, how do you figure out how many G transects to put within each WPA? Well, that whole process is known as a power analysis, and you'll want to get with a biometrician to do this. There's lots of ways. Most of the methods involve simulation, but in this particular case, let's suppose that we had, on the far left was a scenario, and when I worked with the folks in South Dakota, they said, look, could we get away with having like 7 transects on each of our WPAs? When we do a power analysis on it, you figure out that if you have only 7 transects, your ability to actually detect that 5% change that you want to detect in 5 years is actually just over 70%. So, but if you bump this up to maybe 12 transects on each WPA, now our power is well over 80% and maybe something that's much more manageable. So yes, is there a little bit extra cost with going to 5 more transects? It is, but it's far less than the cost of learning at the end of your project that you didn't have enough data to actually inform your management. Now, the data analyses themselves, I mean, again, this is a gulf of things that you could get into, but really there's some basic tenets that you need to think about when you're analyzing your data. I always talk, whenever I talk to folks with a monitoring project, I always ask, can you sketch out just a sketch of a plot that would be very helpful for informing you about your management? Now, I don't have any visual, I don't have any plot of trends in this particular slide, but I don't want to miss the point. I don't want you to miss the point that good graphics are super important when you're talking about providing information in your reports. And also, really make sure that your data analyses are very specific to those management objectives that we set out at the beginning. Remember, in this particular case, the management objectives deals with the increase in native vegetation composition. And so you want to know whether or not you had at least 5% increase in these grassland reconstructions. So in this particular table, what we've got on the left are the different WPAs that were managed. And the reason the ones are in red, if you look at that middle column, that is the percent change, or that's the proportion change actually in the vegetation composition, in the native vegetation composition for each of those WPAs. So you see that every one of those, except for the last two, we had greater than 5%. And you see the lower and upper confidence bounds there. And notice that the margin of error is a plus or minus 0.04. And again, that didn't happen by accident. That's because we had a power analysis that guaranteed that we were going to have a certain precision. Now, just another little plug maybe for adaptive management at this point. You look at the Heppner and the Corbin areas and notice that our management is not really producing much of a change whatsoever with these particular WPAs. Maybe what you do is you go back and you look and you see at this point, is there something different? If there's something systematically different about these WPAs where we're not actually observing the change that we want, and maybe you can go back to the books and talk to your grassland ecologist and figure out, is there something that we can tweak in that decision-making process that I outlined a little bit earlier. This next step, I can't emphasize enough, and that's the idea of reproducible reports. Using data to improve processes and science has to be a transparent process, not only to preserve the integrity of our discipline. So that's sort of a morality check, if you will. But the next check is to simply think and realize that we've all been in situations where we have legacy projects. Projects have been handed over to us, and it takes us months, if ever, to even figure out what the folks before us were actually doing. And so when if you have a plan for reproducibility, you can avoid that learning curve, or not. I mean, there's always a learning curve, but you can flatten that learning curve quite a bit if you actually have a report that's reproducible. And what I mean by that is that, let's say that I've done the data analysis and you have now a new biometrician. If I can hand them a report and they say, how did Tim come up with these results? Okay, well, here's the reproducible report. Redo it yourself and you'll see you get exactly the same results that Tim got. So how do we actually do these reproducible? There's lots of different ways to get reproducible reports. I would advocate for the use of R Markdown. That's something that I've found very effective in projects that I've been involved with. And if you're curious, I would go back, I would take a look at this Ioannidis paper from 2005. It's very, very sobering. The title alone, I think, may get you interested. It says why most published research findings are false. And really, the conclusion that's come to here is that because most of the papers out there, people can't reproduce the results that are actually in the paper unless you are actually the author yourself. Now, the last thing I'd like to just very briefly touch on is that sometimes it's more useful to have a dynamic report, something that you can interact with, than just a flat file annual report. So this, I want to show you this, and this is an app that I built with some collaborators with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they were looking at contaminants in a couple of areas where there was a water cleanup, and this is with 4 different sites. And with the contaminant study, there are hundreds of contaminants that were of interest. And if you can imagine writing a report with hundreds of contaminants, that becomes very cumbersome, and nobody wants to just keep flipping the pages on different plots and analyses based on each contaminant. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and I'm going to try to pull this up. Just give me 1 second so I can show you how this app works. And I'm hoping this will work here. Okay, all right. Let me share this. Okay, so this app lives on a server, and where if you're a manager, and let's say that there, like I said, there were lots of different contaminants that were in the study. So what you can do across the top is there's lots of pages here, lots of flexibility. But let's say here's a particular contaminant along the bottom. These are different sites that are being compared. And you see there's really not much difference in this particular contaminant across the sites. But maybe there's a specific contaminant of interest. Maybe we go down here to DEET. And then notice what happens is that the entire analysis, the figures and everything immediately change by just this drop-down menu. And a lot of times it's very useful when you're able to interact with the data and show people where you're actually seeing differences, and they can see this happen before their very eyes with the analyses. It's often a very powerful tool. So let me go back again. I'm going to stop sharing this, get back to the PowerPoint presentation again. And I'm going to, I don't want to do it from the, let's see here if I can just zoom in. I'm going to be lazy here, but I think all of you are aware that the period of 2021 to 2030 has been declared by the UN the decade of ecosystem restoration. And I think that you would agree that, that when you think about the cost that's associated globally with remediating and restoring degraded habitat, it's estimated to cost over 12 trillion US dollars. That's approximately 2/3 of the GDP in the US. And I would venture to guess that every one of us on this call have been involved with or are involved with a failed or failing restoration monitoring project. So I think the solution to this is to have an evidence-based approach to your management and to the monitoring system. And for an excellent read, and I'll show you this in the references in just a minute, is a paper in 2020 by Linden Meyer entitled Improving Restoration Programs Through Greater Connection with Ecological Theory and Better Monitoring Practices. So there's a list of collaborators, and then I have a list of references. I'm happy to share this presentation with any of you that are interested, and maybe there's a site that we can post it to. But with that list of collaborators, then I invite you to have, if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Tim. Yeah, for everybody on the call, we have about another 10 to 12 minutes here for questions and answers. There should be a button on the bottom next to chat that says Q&A. If people want to type questions into there or the chat, I'll just read them off to Tim as they come in. Don't see anything yet, so I'll give it another minute or two.
I have a good question maybe to start things. Oh, let's go with our attendees first.
Yeah, so we have one question here, Tim. It says, great presentation, thank you. One issue I noticed with quantitative monitoring and management objectives is how to include uncertainty and variability into in your data into making decisions. Do each of the attributes we're interested in have to either be yes, no, meaning meeting or not meeting objectives, or can we include a range or values into our conceptual decision models with a range of utility?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And when I mentioned about let's take, for example, the high, medium, or low litter depth, those were certainly based on a range of values. And you also want to incorporate uncertainty there. I see that one of the questions was, how do you incorporate that uncertainty? And it may be that some of your WPAs you have very little information on. And so you may say, well, my estimate of my native vegetation has gone up by 15%, but plus or minus 12 to 15%. So really, it's got a huge amount of uncertainty there. And so you want to, especially if you can't go and manage every one of the WPAs, maybe you don't go and manage the particular one that's got all of the uncertainty, and maybe you need to go and actually collect more data there. So absolutely, you want to base these on ranges and not just on a specific value.
Thanks. Real quick, we have one question just asking if this talk will be available online. It will be available in roughly a week to 10 days through SER's website. So yeah, look out for that, but this whole workshop will be available. The next question asks, can you elaborate more on how power analysis is utilized?
You bet. That's a great question as well. Let me see if I can go back up here. So how was the power analysis utilized? So I showed you this plot. Let's say that we, on the left there, on the very far left, there was 7 or 8 transects, and then in the middle there might have been, I think, 12 transects, if I can remember from the actual study. Let me go back up to one of my pages here. So looking at this particular page, there's really 2 questions of interest. As I mentioned, there were 222 WPAs, and they did not have the resources to actually go out and monitor every one of those WPAs every single year. So the first question is, how many of those WPAs are we going to go to? And then the next question is, once we go to a WPA, how many transects, how many of these Gs are needed to actually achieve that plus or minus 4% precision that I talked about? So so the power analysis informed us so just as an example, so let's say we have 10 WPAs, each with 4 transects. So 10 times 40, that's 40 different transects. That's an entirely different design than if you only go to 4 WPAs and go to 10 transects within each of those. 4 times 10 is 40, just like 10 times 4 is 40. So you really need to we did a simulation study to observe what is the difference in the power there as far as our ability to detect the 4% change. So it was used in 2 capacities, how many WPAs to go to, and then once we get to a WPA, how many transects.
Next question says, Prof, thanks for such a great talk. Please tell us briefly about the sturgeon data set. Is that a specific tool that you have, or is it a statistical package?
Yeah, very good question. So this is with some folks with the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the Midwest. And there was a water quality study that was taking place. And really, one of the primary things was to look at personal care products, and as far as how they are impacting sturgeon condition indices, as well as their reproductive status. So there's a whole lot written about this. We have a paper that corresponds to this. I'm happy to forward you that. And I'm also happy to provide you the link to this particular app if you're interested. So it's not an R package. It does exist on a server that I could give you. I'd be happy to give you the link to.
Next question says, you assume if you build it, they will come. How do you go from vegetation composition and structure to waterfowl, songbird, and pollinator richness and abundance? Why won't you have to measure those parameters at some point?
Yeah, that is absolutely you do, right? So that would have to be a separate study to actually focus on what abundance would be looking at. So yes, you do have to measure those at some point, but I think that there's enough ecology, especially in this particular zone, this fly zone in the U.S. We know, I mean, birds have been nesting there for a long, long time, since the beginning of time probably. And so we know that if we have good habitat, that we're going to actually attract more of these species of interest. But you're absolutely right. At some point, you are going to have to monitor those. But that's a whole different level when you get into trying to actually measure, abundance of species. And I would, with anything, I'd always view things as a scaffolding sort of approach. Let's try to get it on top of things that we have a good chance of getting on top of, that we can make some reasonable assumptions, like if we build it, they'll come. Then once we do that, let's then beef it up to the next level where we're actually going to take measures on some of those other attributes.
Next question. Do your traditional reports include a link to the R-Shiny interface, or is it a substitute? Do stakeholders and agencies prefer this interactivity option compared to traditional PDF reports? Yeah,
that another very good question. So we do include the links to these R-Shiny apps within the report. But sometimes what I've seen of late is that some of these R-Shiny apps are replacing some aspects of reports, making the reports less cumbersome. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I get a PDF that's 200 pages long, I all of a sudden get very sleepy. But I can actually, if I have something I can interact with, then that's going to have a higher chance that someone that's a decision maker is actually going to maybe do something with that data.
We have a couple questions asking about the difference between the G and line transects. And one of them asks, is there anywhere where they can find more information specifically about the G transect?
I know there's a resource out there that compares the G transect to the line transect. And if some, again, I'm not sure where to respond to folks after this, but I don't have it off the top of my head. It's one of those things, if I remembered where that resource was, I'd have to forget one of my kids' names. I just don't have enough capacity to remember those. But yes, there is a resource on that.
Okay. The next question is, one of the biggest hurdles for restoration appears to be longevity. Funding over the long term to continue management and monitoring can be a challenge. In your experience, what are some strategies to help with this? Is there any general threshold that can be reached where a system is considered restored and doesn't need any more long-term management?
Wow, that's a power-packed question. My first reaction to that is clear communication with stakeholders. We glossed over that at the beginning, but I think if you involve stakeholders from the very beginning and they are bought into what you're actually measuring related to your management, and you have regular meetings with those folks throughout the process, especially the ones that have the purse strings, then that monitoring project has a lot higher success rate than if you're not keeping in close communication with stakeholders. What I've seen a lot of times is that communication takes place with stakeholders at the beginning, and then the stakeholders are never brought in again until there is an issue with funding. And I think you have to maintain a relationship. So that would be my number one thing that I'd recommend. And then as far as when is a system restored, I was working with the Great Lakes Water Quality Assessment. I don't know if I've got the right acronym, but basically what they're looking at is quality of water in Lake Erie. And in particular, there was the Ashtabula River. And so they're trying to clean this particular river up. And so there were these beneficial use impairments that were identified, and we were trying to remove these beneficial use impairments. The idea is that once these beneficial use impairments were removed, and again, these were developed by stakeholders and collaborators, everybody agreed that once these BUIs were removed, then it would be declared that that resource had been cleaned up, and we no longer had to monitor that particular system. And when you're trying to compare something to a control, and I'm glad this question was brought up because that's one of the big principles of restoration, is that you need to have a good control site in many cases. And one thing that's not talked about enough, I think, in restoration is the use of bioequivalence when you're trying to show that you, like in our particular case in the Ashtabula River, we were looking at tumor rates in an indicator species. They were the bullhead catfish. And so we had to show that the tumor rates in this indicator species in the impacted river were the same as the tumor rates in a control river. And when you're trying to show that two things are the same, that's different statistics than what many of us studied in our intro stats class. That gets into bioequivalence.
Okay, we are at 3. If Tim, if you have time for another question
Sure,
or two,
sure.
We'll stay on, but I'm going to stop any question that's not already in here. I'm going to stop reading them. Next question: for private land restoration, getting funding for monitoring is a lot harder than getting funding for project implementation. Do you see utility in case studies?
Oh, wow. I'm not exactly sure. To me, case studies, what I see with case studies is that when you present something as a case study, individuals can take a look at that, and it may not be all of it that you can apply to your particular project, but I think it gives folks a sense of, hey, I think I can do that. I see exactly what's meant by each of these steps, and let me try to do that on my own. So to me, I think case studies are useful if they're not incredibly specific, where you're just like, look, that has nothing to do with my project. But the principles remain the same that I outlined in this talk. So are case studies useful? I hope I presented it in a general enough fashion that you would find it useful. So anyway, I guess that's my response there.
Another question: during which steps would you try to evaluate your plan to eliminate pseudo replication?
Well, in this particular case, the pseudo replication would have been the quadrats that we put down on each of the G transects. So if we have 20 quadrats that we put down, or if you put down 50, which is going to be better? So I think what I would do would be right off the bat is I would probably choose 2 or 3 or more of these WPAs. Some of these I would have 50 transects on, and other, I'm sorry, not 50, but 50 of these quadrats, others with 20. And then I would take those 50 quadrats for a particular WPA. I would randomly sample 20 from the 50 and get my estimated litter cover or litter depth and vegetation cover, and see how much that estimate changes over my samples of 20. And if that sample of 20 is really not providing anything different than what you're getting with the 50, then you can get away with 20 pseudo replicates instead of 50. But we could have a whole separate discussion on that. But yes, you do want to evaluate that. And that is one of the things that we had to do in this project that I didn't talk about in this presentation.
Okay, real quick, a comment to those G transect and line transects. Sandra Correa mentions that she would guess the G transect is more appropriate for herbaceous vegetation, while line transects are better for characterizing trees and shrubs. And then we have one last question here regarding who's responsible for making management decisions. Should this be held on the government or government agencies? And what do you think about regional, local, provincial, and state scales for management decisions?
Well, in this particular case, the government is making, they're the ones that have purchased these WPAs with the duck stamp dollars. So they are making the management decisions on these WPAs, but they're certainly in conjunction with the folks that live around these WPAs. I can guarantee you, if you have a WPA that you're like, oh, well, the litter depth and the has suggested that we have to burn this WPA, and it's right next to the governor's house, it's not getting burned, right? So you've got to figure out who the folks are that you've got to work around and that you've got to work with. So it's not, these decisions are not being made in a vacuum. And I didn't mean to suggest that the Fish and Wildlife Service prioritizes the governor more than maybe you or I that might have land, but I just wanted to give you an example that you do have to think about those that are living around areas, especially when you're burning those areas. And I think they do a good job with that, actually. So
great. And then, yeah, there's just one other comment, how to get in touch. So when we launch this live, I think we'll be able to put contact email addresses for our speakers. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for everybody who attended. I really hope to see people again tomorrow and on Thursday. Tomorrow, Blair Robertson from University of Canterbury, New Zealand, will be talking about spatially balanced sampling designs. And then Thursday, Sam Cox, who's a remote sensing expert for the State of Wyoming Bureau of Land Management Office, is going to talk about some image-based tools to quantify vegetation monitoring. All right, thank you.
Okay. Thanks again for the invite.
Says we should all be in radio. Great webinar. I like that. And a lot, I don't know if you can see these questions, Tim, but there's, you know, a lot just saying thank you very much and great presentation. So yeah, thanks again. All right. I don't know.
Jana, you just need to end the webinar
Okay,
since
I
you're
will
the
do
host.
that.